Hey, welcome to another great webinar here by DemoStack. We've got Dan Katz and Kerry Sokalsky. I'll introduce them properly in a second. I'm Nick Capozzi. I'm just driving the bus. We've got these two gentlemen here who are going to teach us tons about the demo experience. This is the second of a two-part series, but what I'd love to do right now is let us know where you're from. While people are jumping in and joining us, go ahead. You can put in the Q&A or the chat where you're joining us from. I'm in Phoenix. Dan, where are you?
I am in Southern Maryland, in Leonardtown, Maryland, St. Mary's County.
I don't know where that is. How far is that from Baltimore?
That's about an hour and 45 from Baltimore. It's actually closer to DC. It's about halfway between Richmond and DC.
Got it. All right. Kerry, where are you joining us from today, eh?
I'm joining from snowy Toronto.
Well, you wait from
the Canadian accent to a minimum.
I noticed that because you went hard on that last T. It's Toronto. If you're a local, you got to drop that last T, right?
There's no T. There is no second T.
Toronto. Like Toronto. Say it fast.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
All right. Anne's here from Charleston, South Carolina. Everything I learned about the Southern U.S., I learned in Charleston, South Carolina. First place I ever had biscuits and gravy. Who knew that was a thing growing up in Canada? I believe live chat is available. I think the live chat is available. Should be available. Let me quickly try and.
Oh, we're getting that in the Q&A, not in the chat. Yeah.
I think we do have access to the entire. Okay, well, nonetheless, you know what? You can drop it in the queue. Okay, so it says the chat is disabled. I'm going to try real quick to see if I can get that going. Otherwise, we can use the Q&A. Make all that work. All right. Well, Jason's here from Minnesota. That's what really matters. All right. Just before we kick off, Jason, what's the current temperature in Minnesota? Kerry, how cold is it in Toronto? I want to see who's colder today.
What is it today? Hold on.
30 degrees. That's -1 Celsius, Kerry. Doing some quick metric translation here for you.
Very nice.
We're at exactly 32. So we are warmer than Minnesota.
Slightly warmer than Minnesota. All right. Well, let's kick this off. Welcome to Build versus Buy Part 2, Increasing Deal Velocity with a Modern Demo Experience. We're going to get into this, but this is the second part of a series. The first part of whether you should build a demo environment or buy a demo solution. You're going to find that on the DemoStack YouTube page as well as our LinkedIn page. Follow us at DemoStack. Tons of great content about sales, sales engineering, etc. You will find there. So let me ask, is your demo like a game of whack-a-mole or is it a golden ticket for your next customer? In part 2 of this series, we're going to be joined by Kerry and Dan, who I'm going to introduce in a second, and we're going to be covering how today's demos are different than in the past. What are your critical components of the demo platform that are going to maximize your deal velocity? We want to get there, but we want to get there fast. And how do we focus on your prospect, not on your demo environment? But first, Kerry Sokalsky, the founder and president of Pre-Sales Mastery, which provides one-on-one demo call coaching for technical sellers. He spent 20 years in the business. Love that. And another experienced gentleman, Dan Katz, from the team here, head of solution engineering at DemoStack. He's been involved in pre-sales his entire grown-up career. Even before that, even before he actually knew what the name was for pre-sales, he was involved. He's led a ton of demo engineering teams at the enterprise level. Gentlemen, it is a pleasure to have you today here with us.
Thank you, Nick. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here. All right, this is exciting. So let's kick this off. Kerry, let me start with you. How customized does your demo truly need to be?
It needs to be customized enough that it is completely relatable to the prospect. And if we think about, some people have heard me talk about this, but most of our prospects are unsophisticated buyers. And what do I mean by that? They necessarily struggle in how to conceptualize what they always believe is their very unique and complicated and complex situation or case study or approach or process. And unless they see that replicated, specifically how they do it today, a lot of them will struggle to understand how your generic demo model with your generic examples, your generic reports, your generic data is really going to translate into what they need to see. or what they need.
Unsophisticated, but like wicked smart at the same time, and really tuned in to exactly what you're showing them, and sensitive to whether this smells right for them.
Yeah, and so there's another layer of that. One is, can they actually conceptualize what it's going to look like for them, or how it's going to work for their specific use case? The other one is the belief or the trust. To your point, Dan, is, it's great that even if they can conceptualize it, do they truly believe that your solution can do what they specifically need it to do? And so to that end, your demos have to be as representative and realistic as possible to what their expectations or their needs are.
Sounds like you need to be flexible.
You do. I think it depends a little bit on like what type of demo we're talking about too, right, Kerry? Like, would you say, if we're doing a executive overview sort of first call type demo, that level of customization needs to be at the same level as if we're going down a couple of levels deeper in an opportunity?
I would say that I think that and it was interesting because I think you brought this up in last week's session, the first one.
Yeah.
And I think that expectations are going to start to change if they haven't already, with tools like DemoStack and other demo automation capabilities, where it's now easier for organizations to show more representative demos. I think the buyer expectations are going to start to change. And the one thing that we think about is, you can't look at your demo in isolation to that particular prospect, because in most of our demos, we're competing against another vendor. We're not just trying to get them off of a certain current situation or whatever it is. We've got to compete to say that we're the best, and one or more of your competitors are going to show them a customized demo. And if you're not only are you not necessarily going to be able to convince them that your solution can do it, but you're going to look comparatively weaker than the competition. And so I think there's an opportunity cost of not doing it, even if the buyer expectation isn't there that you should do it in that first demo.
That's really well said. I like that. Dan, you got a follow up to that?
No, I think you said it, Kerry. I think you said it. And, I think you were going, Nick, to, how much flexibility do you need in order to make those kinds of customizations?
Well, let's talk about that, because let's talk about flexibility versus control, Dan, and how can a demo solution actually provide the flexibility that I think you want? At least that's what I'm picking up here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not always intuitive. You think you want ultimate flexibility. You want your SEs to be able to change everything, customize everything, but you can't scale that way. And I feel like you have to have control. I like to use the word governance too sometimes, to enable that scaling flywheel, right? Because if you look at a traditional demo environment, like let's say we have a version of our application, or maybe we're even using a live app, that's like the ultimate in flexibility in one sense, because you can just go in and do everything, click anywhere, change anything. But it's also like the other extreme too. It's kind of like the ultimate constraints too, because maybe if you change something, it'll break, or maybe there's live customer data that you don't want to show. There has to be like the balance there. And if you don't have that, things can go wrong really quickly, or it might require like a huge effort to make those kinds of changes. So I think about finding the sweet spot between the Wild West and something that's very tailored and scripted. And you could tailor that demo. You could provide those guardrails based on, maybe it's vertical. So,
right.
I've worked in an environment before where, we do a lot of FinServe, or we do a lot of health tech, or we do a lot of government type stuff. And you can have starting points there. Maybe it's based on segment, company size, or geo. You're going to have a different story for a prospect in Malaysia than you're going to have for a prospect in Canada, for example. Or maybe it's persona based, but having that level of control where you're starting from kind of a set of known constraints makes a lot of sense to me.
But how do you make sure it doesn't become the Wild West and still potentially enable your non-technical sellers to, demo?
Well, I think it's an interesting sort of differentiation there, Nick, is that what Dan's talking about a lot is the flexibility of the demo itself and how it's delivered and what's able to be delivered. It also these solutions provide flexibility for the organization, right? Yeah. The sales and pre-sales organization, to your point, Nick, that now an SE is not the person that necessarily has to deliver every demo. So when you can put guardrails around a demo asset so that your account executive or even your SDR on that initial qualification or discovery call now can bring up a screen or 2 screens or 3 screens. And we know as management that they're not going to be able to go off the rails and click on something they shouldn't, or break something, or end up going down that rabbit hole. That provides the organization with a lot of flexibility because when we think about SEs being challenged, they're mostly challenged around bandwidth. And the fact is, we talked about the need to customize. Customization takes time, right? And so if the tools can speed that up, that's great. But if they can also offload a bunch of intro demos or unqualified demos that SEs are delivering today, that gives those SEs substantially more bandwidth to then further customize their later stage demos when they do get in front of that qualified customer.
Absolutely. And someone just asked, because they have to take a customer call. Are we going to have a recording of this? Absolutely. It'll be on YouTube. It'll be on the LinkedIn page for DemoStack, which you want to follow. And again, part 1 of this series is also there on Build versus Buy. Kerry, let me follow up though. One more question. How does that affect onboarding?
I think it's a huge benefit for onboarding. I think it accelerates onboarding because if we can provide our newer SEs or anybody else that's delivering demos with specific demo models, it's not just here's the generic demo model that you've got to learn how to navigate and talk to specific other situations or use cases that aren't necessarily built in there. But now also we've got a library of demos for each persona, demos for each industry, demos for each geography, even. Whatever the segmentation of your potential customers are, then now we can learn on those. We can start to enable the team on those. And now they're starting to see the different terminology that each of those industry uses. For an example, I spent a decade in the compensation management space. So we talked about salespeople who are mostly the ones that are paid variably. But when we were talking to an insurance company, if we said we're going to allow you to pay your salespeople more effectively, they would say, you don't understand my business. We have agents. We don't have salespeople.
Right.
And so by being able to create a lot of these much more distributed demos across each of these personas and industries, now we can start to actually enable and onboard our team much more effectively so they're able to use the right terminology and diction and use the right use cases for those specific targets.
Have you had experience with that, Dan?
Yeah, I have. It's crazy, how that relates to your first point too, around like how much customization do you need? Sometimes it really is just a little bit of a shift to make it totally click for a prospect. So I mentioned that I'd done a lot of work in government, and at the time, digital services and digital transformation was a big thing. And so if you're a vendor selling into that space and all of your demos are talking about customer this, customer that, that little tweak of replacing customer with citizen, right? It all just makes sense. And that's not a lot of flexibility or a lot of customization that would be needed, but it's just enough. It's like the right amount to help tell the story and make it more relatable for the prospect.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about when a demo goes south. What's you guys have done, I'm going to say thousands of demos. What's usually the culprit?
Never happened to me though. What are you talking about?
Never.
Never.
All right. If it does go south, what's usually the culprit?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of things. I think there's culprits that happen before the demo even starts, right? So we can run into technical challenges around our demo infrastructure is not up, or there's a challenge because we're in a shared environment and one of our colleagues just finished a demo and they made changes and we didn't have time to reset it or to use a separate model. And so now all of a sudden it's broken and we go through it. It doesn't make sense anymore. There's issues around connection speeds and all that kind of stuff. So if you're dealing with, an inefficient or inflexible demo infrastructure, you potentially have to do a lot more work ahead of time to make sure your demo is going to go smoothly before you even start that demo. All right, so that's one. I think there's that. I think the other thing that obviously happens, that's everyone hopefully in this call knows about, is that the things that don't happen before the demo that can kill you. Well, lack of discovery obviously is the obvious one. Inability to prep, right? If you're not prepping accordingly for that demo, then you can show up and throw up, but ultimately you got to make sure that everything's set up correctly so that you're not dealing with technical issues ahead of or during the demo in front of the prospect. So that's, some of the ones that happen beforehand. I think ones that happen during are the same sort of things. Like when we have an inflexible demo model or one that's not representative of it, it's easier for us to get tripped up. Right. Because back to the first point we talked about making your demos relatable and allowing the prospect to be able to conceptualize what their situation is going to look like in the demo. If they don't see that, that's going to derail your demo in terms of questions that you may not be prepared to answer, right? I'm not seeing this. Can you handle this? And that takes you off your script or your flow or whatever, it takes you out of the current, script, whatever you're trying to talk about now, and takes you in these different tangents where you can lose sight of the forest for the trees. And so I think that it's really important that we have a representative data model and demo model to be able to avoid those sort of bizarre questions that are going to come up because we're not representing what the prospect needs to see.
Yeah, and that I think goes back to that balance of flexibility and control, right? If we're too scripted, if we're too controlled, we can't be audible ready. It's a term that I've heard a lot of people use before. And in the ideal state, you have the time to do the prep, you know what's coming. But I'm sure a lot of people on this call have been in this situation where you're sitting in the airport and you're about to give a demo, or someone I talked to yesterday had to rent a car to go give a demo, sit in a parking lot in a rented car. I mean, there's crazy things that happen in this business, and being able to know where to focus your energy when you're doing that prep will make it or break it.
I have a question. Dan, what happens if the demo goes south? What do you do after the demo? How do you clean up that mess?
That's a really good question. I think it's really hard. It's really hard to fix it after it's gone south. I think a lot of it has to be preparation, but it still happens. Even when the demo goes really well, there still can be challenges after it's over. You have to remember that you're going to be in front of a group that's probably talking to 3, 5, 12 other vendors, maybe, right? So how do you stick after you're in front of this team, right? How do you become memorable? How do you ensure that when they think about your presentation, the parts that they remember are the parts that were really connecting with them on a visceral level? Maybe the right people weren't in the room, when you were demoing, and you're going to have to depend on the people that were there to sort of push forward that message after the fact. There's a lot that can happen after, and I think we can talk about this too in a little bit. There's assets that you can create, like leave behinds, but there's also preparation and making sure that you're being memorable and creating the right responses too during that meeting.
I love that. And yes, we are going to talk about leave behinds, and I have so many questions, but if you have questions in the audience, drop it in the Q&A. We've got two, really engaged gentlemen here. Speaking of engagement, how do you create an emotional response from your prospect, Kerry? How do you do that? How do you strike that chord? Well,
I mean, we talk about the obvious ones, right? People remember how you made them feel more than what you told them. Mm-hmm. And so being relatable to your audience is absolutely key. If you can connect with them, then that's a huge thing. I talk a lot about using people's names in your demos, which unfortunately too few people do. When we're addressing someone that we're talking to, call someone's name out.
Like basic stuff that we just don't think about. We get overwhelmed by the stress of having to make sure our tech works that we don't even think about those things sometimes.
Yeah, and it makes a huge difference. I mean, there are studies that have done that show that our brains react to the word that is our name differently than any other word.
Yes.
And so if we think about the majority of our demos are remote these days, and getting and keeping people's attention is a challenge, especially in a long demo when everyone's distracted with emails and everything else. Using people's names is often one of the best ways to get them to pay attention, because their brains are going to hear it and they'll immediately stop and say, okay, great, what's going on? They're talking to me, I got to pay attention. It'll keep their attention, and it'll also get everybody else's attention, because there's an odd psychological thing that's going on, that if someone hears that someone else on their team has been called out by name during the meeting, oh crap, am I going to be called out next? I better pay attention.
Right.
People buy from
Right.
people they like, but people like people who like them. And when you say someone's, it's such a basic thing, but that was something I always taught my sellers, you know, outside of the demo space in live interactions, was how many times in a 30-minute conversation can you casually drop their name? Right, Dan?
Yep.
Just did it there.
Yep. What?
Well played, Nick.
What?
Okay, well, let's I want to stay on creating emotional response, but let's tap
Yeah.
into discovery. Dan, how does good discovery help elicit the response that you're looking for?
So I'm going to preface this by stating the obvious here is that it's not about you. This whole thing is not about you. If we go into a demo or discovery or any sales interaction and we just start talking about how cool our stuff is and all the things you can do with it and how it's a perfect fit, you've already lost, right? You have to focus on who you're speaking to and get them talking. The less you can say and the more you can get them to talk, the better. And that's how good discovery happens, is asking open-ended questions that get the person talking, that help you maybe ask another follow-up question. And 80% of the conversation is just them oversharing about, you know, what their challenges are, what those negative impacts are, what their happy state would be if they could wave a magic wand, and what the positive outcomes would be based on that. What those things that they don't have are, those required capabilities that they need. And then, you know, you can build on that in the sales process and help them understand how your solutions can meet those capabilities there. But it really is not about us. And this is a natural thing. We just want to talk about ourselves. We're excited about our products. We think our tech is amazing. So we want to do that. And I repeat myself all the time. Tech is just supporting cast in all of this. It's a people game that we're playing here. And if we can spend less time, less worry, less stress on, you know, prepping demos and stuff like that, we can really focus on the relationship aspect of the sale and just connecting with other humans.
I love that you touched on quantifying value. Kerry, I'd love to dig into that with you. How do you make sure that that you're contrasting current state versus future state?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing I see in a lot of the demos I coach, is that we're really good, hopefully, at delivering value-based statements and talking about the benefits that our solutions are going to provide. What most people don't do a good job, though, is quantifying that value. And so when we think about, if I were to say to you, we're going to save you a ton of time in your workflows because you won't have to do this, that doesn't sound as impressive as you're going to save 65 hours a week in wasted time because we've automated your workflows now. When you quantify that value, it does two things. One, it makes it more real and tangible. Two is it actually helps in downstream sales cycle pricing objections and pressure.
Yeah.
Right? Because you've already started to prove the ROI during the demo. You don't have to worry about some business case after the fact. And so when they hear a bigger number later on from your sales rep or wherever, you've already showed them exactly how much time they're going to save, how much money they're going to save. And so it's a much more visceral response to the value that can be provided if you can quantify it. Now, to do that, you have to, in most cases, be able to, as you said, Nick, contrast what they're currently doing today and what their future is going to look like with your solution. And that takes a lot of questioning. It's to Dan's point, you've got to engage in good discovery, but you've got to do a couple things. One is you really truly need to understand, you know, what are the underlying details about those challenges today, right? How much time are you spending on that today? Not just you're spending too much time on it, right? So the discovery's got to be quantified. And then the future state is, well, what would happen if that challenge went away? And ask the prospect to do that. Because the other thing we typically run into in challenges around business cases is people don't believe the numbers. We pulled them out of our butt, or we cited some, you know, arbitrary customer use case or whatever it is. But if they're telling us how much time they would save or they would spend on this, they can't refute those values later on, right? So you're almost building a bulletproof case.
And even having them help you build the model, right? And not coming to the table with like your calculator that you've built for these hypothetical scenarios, but, you know, engaging the prospect and actually modeling out that business value. And I'm going to bring us back to where things go south, and I'm going to say something, and to caveat here, I love salespeople. I love them. I need them. I depend on them. I have to feed my kids because of salespeople. But when we lead with pricing, or we get into the pricing conversation too early, all that value engineering that Kerry's talking about goes out the window.
So let me ask you this. If I'm picking this up correctly, Kerry, we want to be more focusing on their personal pain points than the corporate pain points, right?
Yeah. So this is a really, I think, effective way to win over members of the buying audience and the buying committee. Is we too often, I think, in discovery and in how we're articulating benefits, we think about the corporate and the business challenges that they're facing. We're not really asking the right questions or addressing the value in terms of how it's going to help you, Mrs. or Mr. Buyer, on that buying team, right? How is it challenging for you? So if I could say to you, for example, look, you're going to save 65 hours a week because of this. You don't have to go chase all your sales reps to get their numbers from them in the CRM or whatever it is. And that's going to let you, Lisa, go home and spend more time with your 2 young kids. So you tell me, on a Friday when you have to hit payroll, you've got to stay in the office and make sure everything's done. You can't, right? Make it relevant for them personally.
I love how you stabbed yourself in the heart there, Dan. Like that was, but that invoked such a visceral response in you that was your natural reaction. And I love that.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about emotional, because I think, I knew nothing or very little about sales engineering before 8 months ago. And the two things of all the sales engineers and leaders I've talked to, the two most important things are discovery and storytelling, which ties into engagement. So, we touched on discovery, but I think engagement is so key. How do you get someone to, turn the camera on? How do you get someone to not pay attention to the second screen? So I want to dig in a little bit more, but first we have a question from the audience. In today's remote demo world, other than using their name, Dan, do you have any tips for making an emotional connection with the buyer?
Yeah, video, right? Like I have to make a conscious effort to stare at that little green light on the screen when I'm talking to you, and I can lean into the camera, and I can use, there's little tips and tricks for playing with cameras, playing with video that I think are important. I think similarly, when you want them to be focused on what you're saying and not what's on the screen in front of them, you could turn off video, you could turn off screen share. There's a lot of those tricks that I've picked up in the last few years that have been helpful. And then follow up too. Like you have your venue where you're talking to the buying team, but then reaching out individually and building those individual single thread relationships with different stakeholders is just as important too. This is maybe my Gen X showing here, but I like calling people on the phone. I like to have their phone numbers if I have a question, rather than texting or emailing. Having the permission to do that is really critical too.
I love that. Speaking of Gen X, I'm going to see Smashing Pumpkins and Jane's Addiction this Friday. So, I'm
nice. Oh my God. Awesome.
I know. Christine Zimmer's got a great question. So touching on personal pain point, not all participants are necessarily in the discovery. So how can you touch on only 1 or 2 out of the group? Any suggestions on how to touch on more of the attendees, Kerry?
Well, they're going to have to watch a recording of the session you did with Chris and I on Monday. That's the first one. So I talk.
By the way, Kerry's talking about go-to-market this week, where we talk about all things go-to-market here at DemoStack. We released it on Tuesday.
Awesome. I talk a lot about a current situation slide as a good framing slide when you start the meeting. And hopefully our sales reps are the ones that are bringing this up at the start. If they're not, hopefully we're telling them they should. If they're still not going to do it, we bring it up before our demos. But the current situation slide to me is just validating what we've learned and what we've heard in terms of what their current situation is, what their challenges or issues are, what they're trying to solve for, and what their overall objectives are. What are they looking to achieve? Because it's a really good point. Most discovery audiences are a subset of the whole buying committee, but definitely the demo audiences. And every individual on that buying team is in the room for a reason. They don't like, as much as people, like to collect a paycheck and go home, people don't like to waste an hour of their time in meetings they don't need to be in. So if they're in your demo, there's a reason they're there. And every individual's got their own unique perspectives, needs, requirements, objectives, et cetera. And so bringing that slide up allows you to validate not only what you've heard, but also gives you the opening to then ask the folks that weren't in that discovery to say, look, I know you were involved. Is there anything unique or different that you'd like to add? Any challenges that you're experiencing? I want to make sure that we're making this the best use of everybody's time. And that resonates. That's the first chance you're getting to individually connect with those people. Let them know that you want to hear them. You're here to listen.
Yeah. I also like asking for their help, right? So is there anybody else that we should be talking to? Who else in the organization do you think is going to be impacted by this decision or has a say in this project? And by having that first rapport, that smaller subgroup, they're gonna open the doors to other people that you may not even be aware of at the time, and potentially avoid a blind spot later on. Like, oh, by the way, our IT team is actually building something themselves. How many times have we heard that one? Something like that.
No, you nailed it. One more thing about engagement, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here because we could talk for 2 hours just about storytelling. Obviously, such a critical skill for sales engineers. But give me, Kerry, just a couple, because there's so much more I still want to get through in the rest of our time today. Give me a couple things that you're thinking when it comes to telling a story. Let's even talk specifically to one persona. How do you kind of divvy that up?
I think that's what people get really caught up on when they hear that I have to tell customer stories or whatever it is that it's got to be this huge built up Hollywood, type production where I've got to build up to it. And there's got to be a climax and 3 acts and got to build the characters up. You don't need to do that. It can be a tiny anecdote that's 1 sentence long. You told us that you're challenged around this. Here's how we're going to improve that for you guys. And it's really interesting because our client Acme Corp did this with us, and this is what it allowed them to achieve. And that's it. 10 seconds, you did a small little anecdote, you threw it in, but it's going to reinforce the fact that you've been successful doing it, because we all know that it's much more effective to tell your prospect how you've solved their problems for other people rather than I can solve your problem. Right?
Because they see themselves, right? It goes back to that stab in the heart, right, Dan? Dan, tell me about storytelling.
Add the emotional edge whenever you can. I think, in my selling career, one of the most effective stories I told, we were selling a web platform for New York City, and we basically would tell the story of Hurricane Sandy came in, and they were really worried that sites were going to go down, and they wanted to do stress testing, and everything looked good. And then hurricane came in, and it flooded their center, and all the phone lines were down. So the website stayed up, but nobody could have internet access and update the website. And so they were able to text message, our support team, and we'd make the updates on their behalf. Like, it's not just how the customer was successful, but tying in some sort of emotional color in there as well. People love that.
I'll throw one more thing in there, Nick, and this also addresses sort of the last question we talked about, which was, other than using people's names, how do you make that connection? I think sales reps do this a lot better than SEs in general, in terms of researching every person that's going to be on that call or that demo, and understanding something about every one of them individually. Find out a company they worked at before that you have a connection to. Find out where they went to school, so you can find out, did their team win the football game last week? Saturday beforehand. Find some sort of connection you can make to each individual person there, because that'll help build the relationship, but also it can help color your stories. And if you relate that to the story, right?
I'm going to shut myself up because I could go down a rabbit hole about that. Rapport building changes everything. Like, the first thing that I mentioned when Dan popped on before we started this today was, oh, you're in Leonardtown, Maryland. If Dan is someone that I'm going to demo for, I'm Googling Leonardtown, Maryland, right? I looked at his LinkedIn profile. Hey, Dan, I noticed Dan, I noticed that you took that contract negotiation course at such and such academy. Like, what was the key thing that you learned from that? I'll never forget this one time when I was consulting. I came in, it was one of the first demos I was ever on in the B2B space. And there was 6 people from our side waiting quietly and 8 people from their side waiting on one person, and it was crickets. So I sat there and I was just looking up people on LinkedIn and finding conversation points. So what happened was everyone was more warmed up. They were more excited about the conversation. So I can't stress that enough. We should do a whole session just on that. All right. If you have questions, we've got about 10 minutes left. I would love to hear your questions, but otherwise I want to get to some deal velocity, because we want to get things through the sales cycle quickly. Kerry, what is the key to getting the inertia that you want on your deals?
Yeah, I think a lot of these are probably pretty obvious, but they're important, right? Is so, one thing is there's been a lot of research that so many of SE demos are unqualified. And the beautiful thing about these solutions is that you give the customer the opportunity, or the prospect the opportunity to qualify themselves. And so they're qualifying themselves right out of the top of the funnel. And so the nice thing about that is we're almost lopping off the top of the funnel for SEs and saying we're only going to actually be engaged with self-qualified prospects who we can help, right? Because they're not going to waste more of their time after watching an auto demo, right, with us, because if it can't help them, they're the best ones to determine if we can help them. Now, obviously, that's incumbent upon us delivering a good auto demo. It's got to tell the right stories. It's got to project the right value. If it doesn't, if the auto demo doesn't tell the right story, then you're not going to qualify them out. But that's the big one is let's sort of build in a buffer against what I call sort of the AE demo crutch movement, which is, I don't know where to go with this deal, or I just want to get engaged with these people.
Have a demo.
Why don't we show you a demo? Because everyone loves a demo, and MISE loves giving demos to people they don't know anything about. So I think that helps avoid that substantially. I think there's the obvious one around the fact that when you are leveraging these sort of auto demos ahead of time, you've got much better insight into what that prospect actually wants to solve for and what they're interested in, right? There's lots of fantastic analytics about engagement with these demo models, not just which pages or screens did they see, but how long did they stay there, which options did they select if they're multi-branch demos and things like that. What are their sort of preferences they have if you have the ability to do Q&A in them. And so now all of a sudden, we're coming to those demo meetings substantially more prepared to have better engaging conversations because we know exactly what's important to that prospect and we can avoid all the crap that they don't care about.
I love that.
I love
Dan,
that.
you're dying to say something. I want to hear what you got. Tell me.
Well, because you're not spending hours and hours and hours and days just building the tailored demos. You can spend less time on that. You're removing friction. And
right.
There's limited resources, right? That you as an SE, you have 10, 20, however many opportunities you're working on. If you know that they're self-qualifying, if you know that they know something about the product, you've done some good discovery, then the limited time you have, you can just spend on doing something really focused and controlling it. I always go back to, maybe I'm a control freak, I probably am, but you're holding the keys, right? You're saying, okay, now you're interested. You see how there's some value here for you. You want to learn more. You want to prove, maybe there's a proof of concept, right? I want to see how it works. Or maybe there's a workshop type motion where we're guiding them into, following along and being hands on keyboard. But just going into it and understanding that you're going to have more likelihood to actually win a deal because it's been qualified to that level. Is the biggest thing. There's just so much noise and friction that happens inside of a deal, typically, that being able to self-qualify and being able to just focus on like those small parts that are going to be very tailored and personalized and doing that quickly is an accelerator.
We got about 5 minutes left. Last call on the questions. Drop them in the Q&A. I'd love to hear from you. But let's speed this up. We got a couple more minutes. Kerry, what tools, process, techniques are not currently being leveraged enough by SEs?
This one may be controversial, but I would say selling recently or soon to be released features, either because they're not in production or they haven't been built into the demo models yet. Or because there's a fear of selling futures, whatever it is. I don't think we should be selling things we're going to release in 2 years. But if we know that something was just released, or we know that it's coming out in the next 2 months, we often don't have the ability to demo it effectively, even if we do want to. And that's what's really nice about these demo automation tools is that they provide you with the ability in a fairly controlled environment. We talked about control versus flexibility earlier, to show these things where they're not going to break because we can limit where someone can go in the demo to restrict that. And you can build them into an auto demo environment that it doesn't have to necessarily be in production yet. So that to me is one thing that I think that, the new releases, the new features is usually the exciting stuff, the stuff that's differentiating you from the competition. And that's stuff we'd all like to be able to show, but we just logistically can't. Now we have the opportunity to do so. So I think that would be something I think is
Dan, over to you quickly, because I got a great question queued up here.
Yeah, I love that. I think, we don't often leverage trials or I've talked about workshops a little bit, but trials effectively, because it's hard to do that, right? It's hard to manage environments for customers, to make sure they have the right permissions to support them. And so with demo platforms, that becomes a whole lot easier. You're basically creating a sandbox type of asset that looks and feels just like your actual application, that you can get someone hands-on with and really help them be successful in using that, and not have an endless type of trial experience. And then if I want to be cheeky too a little bit, Nick, I think what we don't leverage enough sometimes is just our ears. I'm going to say that. I'm going to repeat that over and over again. We got to be good listeners here.
That's a
it's
fact.
Cheeky.
It's not. It's not cheeky. It's straight facts, Dan. Straight facts. Yeah. Okay. One more question from the audience. I think it's going to lead into my last question. So, Kerry, how can I help my champion in the prospect's company reiterate to their stakeholders the aha moment we've shown them in the demo to help get buy-in and help win the deal?
Yeah. So
that question.
The one obvious one is, and we think about, what are we doing in our demos? We are basically taking a fire hose and shoving it down our prospects' throats for 45 minutes to an hour. So there's a lot of stuff that we're showing them. Typical studies have shown that we can't remember more than 7 to 10 things in any given session anyways. And so your prospects are not remembering 90% of what you tell them in the demo. So it's super important, A, that you summarize your key points at the end of your demos to reiterate, make sure they leave the meeting with those top of mind. But the other one is that most people unfortunately don't do well, and that now demo automation tools are enabling in a much more effective way, is the use of a leave behind. And so leave behinds used to be, I'm going to create a slide deck, or I'm going to take a bunch of screenshots and I'll put a couple captions on it to show what the value message was and hope that you go through it and you can share that with everyone. Now we can actually send them the full demo environment, again, with overlays that talk about, what the value is as they click through the screens, but they can do it on their own time and they can share that internally. The nice thing about these tools is they give the prospect the ability to share these assets internally super easy, where the vendor doesn't have to get involved. The vendor, however, does get visibility into who it's been shared with, which I think you made this point much earlier on, Dan, is massively allows us to get exposure into who on the buying team should be engaged with that we probably don't even know about, right? And so that's a huge benefit, but massively more impressive leave behinds, because if we think about it too, not only are we driving the fire hose down our throats, but we're competing, like talked about this earlier, we're competing against other vendors, and they're showing them that much stuff. And it's hard for them to remember who had that really cool report I liked, or who had that really neat workflow feature. Now they've got the ability to just look at it all themselves on their own time, remember as much as they need, they're good to go.
Dan, I'm going to get to you with that same question, but real quick, I just dropped the YouTube link for the first part of this series, where it was actually Jacob Suchi and Dan who talked about building versus buying. But talk to me quick, Dan, 1 minute on leave behinds, my friend.
So I think we can take leave behinds to the next level. And, with the technology that we're using here at Demo Stack, we're able to use what we call like a high fidelity clone of an actual environment. And so we're going beyond just the click throughs here, but imagine, if you will, for a moment, you have a champion in your organization and you're giving that champion a sandbox and enabling them how to use that. They can go and they can actually shop that around internally. They can get people in a room. They can deliver that same demo. They can allow people to touch and feel that application in a way that is, a different level than a guided tour. And I see that as the direction of certain kinds of leave behinds that just makes that aha moment repeatable over and over and over again.
Yeah, the one best practice I'd add to that is, after you've gone through your proof of concept or you're meeting with them and you're sending them a leave behind, make sure your overlays include comments that were made by the prospect during the demo.
Love that.
That's great. That's
something
awesome.
They really liked. Make sure everybody else on their team knows that they like that or why this was important to them.
Wow. And with that, I mean, I have to wrap it up on that, because we are at 45 minutes. I will thank you, gentlemen, in a second. But last thing, I also dropped in chat DemoStack's LinkedIn page. You want to follow us for tons of great content on sales engineering, sales in general, go-to-market strategy. Dan Katz, Kerry, Sokalsky. Gentlemen, I appreciate you guys doing this with us today. We need to do more of this because this was a great session. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I learned a lot. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.